Welcome to Drinking on the Edge. Frank Coleman joining me in the studio to have you here talking about the George Washington Distillery is my co-host and friend, Carlo DeVito, located here in the back of the Epicurean Shop and Cafe in beautiful hamlet of Rhinecliff. We'll do that again. Yeah. This will be edited out. We're located in the back of the Epicurean, here in the Rhinecliff hamlet, encompassed by Rhinebeck, and along the banks of the Hudson River. And joining us in the studio as well is our producer, Matt Mercier, and my pup, Snowden.
Yes.
And so our reason for being here today is to talk about the George Washington Distillery. Frank, tuning in. Were you tuning in from, Frank?
I'm in McLean, Virginia.
All right. Well, he was he's basically in charge of his strategies company these days. But for a long while, he was a key figure at the very important nationwide organization called Discus, where he, in regards to our subject matter today, he was responsible for the organizing of the launch events of the George Washington Distillery, along with bringing together the master distillers, creating the American Whiskey Trail, of which the aforementioned GWD serves as its gateway. So he is going to be mostly queried by Carlo, in as much as Carlo, being the author of the hardcover, quite great doorstop of a book called The Spirit of Rye, is far more expert on this than I, so take it away, Carlo.
Okay, well, for those of you who aren't familiar, the George Washington Distillery at Mount Vernon is a relatively new venture, but originally started way back in the late 1700s when the former president began his distillery. And at the time, it's believed it was one of the largest distilleries of the period, producing around 11,000 gallons a year, which is a pretty sizable distillery, especially when compared to craft distilleries today. They made brandies and they made rye whiskey, and the whole distillery and grist mill that Washington created have been recreated through the efforts of Frank and a number of other people. And so we thought it'd be a great opportunity for one of the really great whiskey museums in America to have him on. They still make whiskey there. We'll get to that later on. But Frank, you've been involved with this almost from the get-go. Why don't you describe how you and Discus and several of the other organizations came to put this together?
Okay, well, as you may know, the Mount Vernon is run by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which are basically society types from across the country. And so when they found out that they had reconstructed the grist mill on the site, it's a couple miles from the mansion, as a CCC project during the Depression. But they discovered Washington had a distillery. It was in the mansion records. He kept voluminous records. And they decided they wanted to rebuild it. So they went to the Browns of Brown-Forman fame in Kentucky and said, would you be willing to, finance the reconstruction? And so their lobbyist came to my boss, who was Admiral Peter Cressy, who was running the Distilled Spirits Council at the time. And he brought me into the conversation, and they believed it was an industry project. Peter went to work. We immediately raised like $2 million overnight to reconstruct the distillery. And we also brought in the wine and spirits wholesalers. They also participated in the initial reconstruction. But it was as though you were finding out that the only thing better than finding out that the father of our country was a distiller. Remember, in 2001, it wasn't the same sort of, cocktail culture kind of thing. We were still sort of demon rum, and we were trying to get back on television and all these other, we were trying to get our market access improved. But anyway, the only thing better than finding out that the founding father was a distiller would have been if the miracle at Cana had been whiskey instead of wine. Literally. And it was like a no-brainer. And Peter saw that instantly and said, this is terrific. And we got into a major partnership with Mount Vernon. We sat down with them. I immediately came up with this idea that we would bring the master distillers down, and for the groundbreaking, I had all of the major members ship barrels down that they were going to age on the grounds at Mount Vernon. So that was the origin of a lot of the product that started. Now, they weren't originally making product in the distillery. The distillery was just at that point was a construction site, an archaeology site, in fact.
And we're talking around 2001, 2002, or we're talking 2000?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the groundbreaking was in May of 2001, and we got the companies all to send barrels. So we had Mount Vernon Jack Daniels, we had Mount Vernon Maker's Mark, we had Mount Vernon Wild Turkey, Mount Vernon I.W. Harper, we had Mount Vernon Four Roses, but that's another story because it never really got bottled because Seagram's got sold before we bottled. Anyway, so then the chief historian, who was our partner in this reconstruction, a guy named Dennis Pogue, came to us and said, Christie's is having an auction of a rare letter written by George Washington attempting to get more grain for the distillery. And in it, he writes, it's basically an introduction letter for his man going to his cousin, Colonel William Washington. And he says he's holding 60 gallons for him to pick up, but you better hurry up and get it because the demand for this product in these parts is brisk. So that became the motto for the whole project. The demand is brisk. And, we put that in everything. And so we bought the letter and we put it on display in state capitals and brought it around and talked about the project. Let's see. So then we had the distillers the next year in 2002. We had all the distillers come down, and they were hand bottling the barrels that they had aged on the grounds. So, for example, I have the Wild Turkey and I have the Woodford Reserve here, and they all had this Mount Vernon still, copper pot still symbol. Okay. So this was on every bottle by every company. Okay. So this was the Wild Turkey. Normally this is a single barrel. It's a Kentucky Reserve or something like that. And they called it Presidential Reserve. So they all made special labels.
So
some of them were
let me ask you this, Frank. So they did that bottling, and then in 2007, you had the grand opening ceremony, and it was around that same time that they actually worked together to distill the first rye in the distillery in 200 years. Is that correct?
Actually, that was 2003 we brought them back to make the first recipe. It was on that pot still that Vendome created. Mike Sherman from Vendome created. There was a pot still in the Smithsonian collection. It actually had been at the TTB, but they had donated to the Smithsonian. And so he went in and he hand measured all of the bolts and recreated the exact
whole thing,
design. Yeah. And it had been stamped Bristol, so it was made in Bristol, England.
And you had lots of press there, and I have to say, just for the audience, because this is fun, you had some of the top distillers in the United States there at that event. You had Chris Morris from Woodford, you had Dave Pickerel from Maker's Mark, you had Jimmy Russell from Wild Turkey, Fred Noe from Jim Beam, and Lincoln Henderson, who had been at Woodford, Brown-Forman, and eventually went on to found Angel's Envy. So you're talking some of the creme de la creme of distilling, not just at that time, but of any time. And that's a pretty remarkable group of guys. And I think you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. What was fascinating was that I know journalists who covered the event still talk about it because they all got dressed up. Why don't you tell that story very quickly?
Well, it was funny, yeah. They put them in colonial costumes. The hardest thing was find a costume that would fit like Jimmy Russell. They just didn't have that in a wardrobe. It's not like XXL. But yeah, so they were all there, and there were pictures of it that I can give you with them all wearing the hats. You may have some of those, but yeah. So they all conspired together to make George Washington Distillery, and it was actually out next. They created a brick thin area about 60 feet from the distillery where they put that pot still, and they had to build an apparatus to hold it. But it was over an open flame that they were cooking.
Well, all right, so that's going to get us to the next conversation, which is for those people who haven't been there, who haven't seen photos of it, you've got, I think they have 3 or 6 pot stills that were all created. 5. Okay, so there you go, somewhere in there. They're all hand done. They're all created by Vendome, and they sit over these brick furnaces, and the brick furnaces are actually heated by wood fire. And one of my favorite stories when I was covering this was about Mark Meltonville, who had come from, he's an Englishman who has created many foods from the Tudor period and was known to run the Tudor dinners that are given in England. And he showed them how to make the fire so you didn't spike the still. Because if you unevenly made your fire, you were going to puke the still. So it was very important for them to learn. We're not turning on the gas and making stuff here. This is really very interesting, fascinating stuff. And and of course, this was manned by slaves. These were slaves. We have the names because Washington kept such good records. And Mount Vernon has done a really good job of trying to recreate their lives and keep their memories alive and pay homage to them as well. So,
and it's open to the public, so people can go and see how they distilled in colonial times. It's the only place in America that I'm aware of that you can do that you actually see the process as it was in Washington's time.
No, that must be unique in the world, let alone in the United States.
Yeah. Well, you never know.
Now, how did I know Pickerel was instrumental in helping to recreate the rye recipe? We need to get this short because we want to get to the tasting. But can you tell us a little bit about? I know that certainly Dave was a friend of mine, and Dave was one of the great Johnny Appleseeds of rye, bringing rye back.
Yes.
Just tell me just a real quick story about Dave and the George Washington Distillery.
Dave was my co-conspirator in a way because we came to after we bottled all the original single barrels products that had been aging on the grounds, we still had 11 barrels or so with, 5 gallons in one, 8 gallons in another, 10 gallons in a third. And so I proposed to him, and he agreed immediately that we bat it all together and then bottle it and rebottle it. And so we did that, and we actually passed a law in Virginia allowing Mount Vernon to sell. And there's photos of Dave and Joe Dangler, who was then the Virginia gentleman distiller, instrumental in this process as well. And us vatting the stuff on the lawn down by the river, and then in a industrial vat, and then putting it back in a barrel and letting it marry, if you will.
Right.
And we decided to call it George Washington Distillery Vatted American Whiskey because I was kind of sticking it to my friends at the SWA because, there was a whole big controversy over labeling going on at that time. This was 2005, going on in UK over Scotch label.
Right. Vatting was a dirty word.
Right. Vatted became outlawed, actually. You couldn't call it vatted Scotch anymore. And so I decided we would call this vatted American whiskey, sort of to give them.
So today, George Washington offers 3 different whiskeys. They offer the George Washington Rye whiskey, which is an unaged whiskey, as Washington himself sold it back in the day.
That would be the clear stuff.
Yeah, the clear stuff, as they say. Then there's the George Washington's 5-year-old premium whiskey, which they do offer there as well. And then they have the straight rye whiskey as well. So these are all there. And then they also offer peach brandy and rum and apple brandy. Yeah. So it's a pretty fully developed distillery, although they still deal in small quantities. Almost 95% of the bottles that I know of are all 375 millimeter. I don't know if too many 750s.
Part of it is also the cost factor, I think.
Okay.
They're not inexpensive because of a variety of political reasons. But
so
anyway,
Frank, the whiskey that you sent us, these are 3 bottles of the same. Is that correct?
Yes, those are the vatted whiskeys.
These are the vatted whiskey.
Yes. So they originally made 200 case bottles that were in hand-blown glass case bottles. They were square. If you were a gentleman in 1800, you would have your bar look like an open suitcase on legs, and you had the bottles would fit in that. But anyway, they sold those at one price for $250 a piece. They were hand-blown at Jamestown Glass Works, and so we sold that at the dinner for $250 a piece. And then we still had a barrel or a barrel and a half. So we got this law passed that they could sell this at Mount Vernon. It's basically the mini bottle and the shot glass with the logo.
Okay.
Can you see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. So they sold 10,000 of them, and then they weren't going to buy any more boxes. Or actually, just so you know, the first sale of the mini bottles, they were lined up to a mile to Route 1. We had to have cops to control the crowds. It was a big deal. Yeah.
So this vatted whiskey that we have is how many? It's about 4 or 5 different producers at this point.
No, it's actually on the back. It says it's Jack Daniels, Jim Beam, Wild Turkey,
okay,
Old Barton, Very Old Barton, Virginia Gentleman, George Dickel, Maker's Mark, Woodford Reserve, I.W. Harper, Rebel Yell, and Platte Valley. And Platte Valley, which wasn't a straight whiskey, so that's why we couldn't call it straight whiskey.
So this is a lovely whiskey. I mean, it's got some really nice corn flavor to it. I mean, that cereal flavor that comes through. It's got some nice. Wow, it's got a real nice smooth burn to it. It's really quite lovely.
It's over 60%.
Sure.
So it's not for the
faint of heart.
Exactly.
But it's super smooth. It's got just a real creaminess to it. It's got just a touch of Christmas spice to it at the very end. You get that little sort of ginger pepper.
I think it might be a little tannic.
But this is a really.
It wasn't aged in ideal conditions.
No, I think it's a pretty lovely dram there, and obviously a very rare one to say the least.
Yeah. So anyway, the last case of these mini bottles is down in my wine cellar.
Well, there you go. There you go.
So I give them to my friends.
So there you go. So I think that's the quick story of George Washington's distillery at Mount Vernon. You can go on the website and they'll tell you when the hours are operable, and you can actually go and watch them go and make whiskey.
This is so people understand more clearly. This is a fully operational, functioning distillery that is an accurate recreation of how things were done then, and not just in every little step along the way. Can you please describe in a little bit more detail things that people might see when they do show up? Besides the distilling operation, are the grains being grown there, for instance?
Yes, some are, but the grist mill is there too.
That's important.
And that is a very unique grist mill.
Well, that's another one of the fun things is that the grist mill, especially in those days, preceded having a distillery. And they recreated an actual grist mill from the period. So they have to have a stone sharpener come out every 6 months to take apart the mill, sharpen the stone, and then continue making flour and grist for the whiskey and flour for sale at the distillery.
And when Washington built that grist mill, it was state of the art. It was absolute state of the art grist mill. So, and yes, he did grow the grain, but he obviously needed more because the distillery was, using so much.
He had bought 5 farms in the area and was using all 5 farms to fuel this distillery.
Yeah. And, rye was really the grain of the East Coast at the time.
And wasn't I led to believe as well that Washington was one of the largest, if not the largest, volume distiller in Virginia at the time of his life?
Yes. There might have been larger rum distilleries at the time in Boston, but this was the largest whiskey distillery, probably the largest whiskey distillery in America.
Wow. Now, was that his greatest source of income, the production of
No.
whiskey?
He had fisheries. He had several other agricultural, but it quickly became the 3rd or 4th most valuable source of income for the farm.
Yeah, and it was one of the most profitable.
Yeah.
Do we know how many people were employed with remuneration versus those who were enslaved at the time of the distillery's peak?
I think you had the plantation son, the plantation manager's son was the master distiller, and then he had an assistant. And
there was a fellow from Scotland, wasn't it? I think I remember reading about that.
Yes, it was, and that was the Scottish connection. We later had the Scotch distillers come in and make single malt on the distills after the distillery was reconstructed. So that's another story. He was from outside of Edinburgh. He was born, and so he knew how to distill. And he was the one that went to Washington and said, "Boss, if you get me a still, I think I know what I can do with the excess grain that we have, rather than sending it to our factors in London." And so that was the origin of it. It was really that guy, John Anderson.
So at the time, it's reported 11,000 gallons of whiskey were being made, but as well fruit brandies, apple, persimmon, and such were also being made.
Yeah.
They're also being made today at the current GWD. And what do you know? What 11,000 gallons was a lot of spirits at that time. Do you know what the current production level is, more or less?
I don't know.
Okay.
David, do you know?
No, I don't. No, I would say it's more near 5 is my best guess from my conversations.
And are the tree fruits also being grown there at the Mount Vernon estate for
No, I think they bring them in. The first time we did peach brandy, they were brought in from Indiana. Ted Huber of Huber Starlight, led that project for us because he makes some of the best brandy in America. And so he's an experienced, and he secured the fruit for the brandies, the specific type, of peach that would be relevant, for brandy distilling.
Yeah, I'm sure he knows the way around persimmons, in as much as any persimmons not grown on the west coast of the U.S. They're grown in southern Indiana and a little bit in southern Ohio. That's where persimmons found themselves in the United States.
In Washington's time, they were distilling the brandies mostly for use at the mansion table, not for commercial purposes.
Sure.
So just for their own consumption. But obviously he had a big commercial operation. They had different grades of rye whiskey that they were producing. They had the once or twice distilled, and then they had 4 times distilled, and they sold for different prices in Old Town Alexandria to the merchants there. And the Washington label was, the sign that it was absolutely great whiskey. And so,
So the
I'll say what I was going to say.
so the mash bill, as I recall, is following the original recipe of 60% rye, 35% corn, and 5% malted barley. And it bears asking, were the maltings done at the Washington estate at the time, and are they today?
yes,
Right?
they were.
Takes a lot of work.
That's a lot of work all by itself.
Yeah. I mean, those guys stirring with those mash,
With cooking all those grains is a lot of work, and steeping those grains and then having to rake them every 4 to 8 6 hours it's time consuming, to say the least.
in the first instance, we were using like an oar or something from a boat, rowboat oar.
I think it's probably gotten slightly more sophisticated since then.
Yes, it has. It has.
Well, that makes sense, using a boat oar, in as much as Mount Vernon faces the water in great part too, eh?
Right. Beautiful. Yeah. Right on the Potomac. And that's where we hold the dinner every year. It's now grown to, 1,000 people, but originally it was a couple hundred, and mostly focused on the industry.
Fascinating. And how many people work at the distillery today? Do you have any clue?
I think around a dozen. And now there are some volunteers that participate, when they're cooking, but they actually have a gift shop there in what was the proprietor. There's a house there on the property between the distillery and the grist mill. But you probably have even more at the grist mill, because that's a labor intensive as well.
Right.
So in my readings, in the spirit of rye, I came across the fact that Mount Vernon was declared a national landmark in 1960, in as much as it had been its upkeep had been done by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association dating back to the mid 19th century. And they still remain an active part of its development and administration. I'm led to believe. Yeah.
Yes. They're basically the board of directors. They saved the mansion. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be there. In the 1850s, it was in total disrepair. And they came in and they raised money. And there's a story about how someone stole the money and then they had to raise it all over again. And it was just, it's incredible. They don't get any government funding. It's all private. And so, if anybody wants to join, there's memberships available, and you get them through the website, and you get all kinds of perks.
I have to say, there's nothing. It's just a tremendous day to go and see the mansion and see the distillery and the grist mill is an education in and of itself, and really just a fascinating day. You can't go wrong with any of it.
Yeah, they've now built a presidential library there, and they have all kinds of weird documents in it. And the visitor center, they built that in about 2010, roughly, under the previous director, a brilliant guy named Jim Reese, who helped design. The visitor center is amazing. I mean, it's got a theater in it. It tells the story of Valley Forge, and it starts to snow on you. And
it's an amazing place. It really is.
Yeah.
And go back to the point of what brings us here to Drinking on the Edge, the rye that we're tasting. In great part, I'm not going to say solely, but in great part, the recreation of the distillery and the creation of the rye whiskey and the adjacent spirits as well was taking place and helped to move along the resurgence of not only of craft spirits, which was already pretty well in place by 2006 or so, but more specifically the interest in rye whiskey as a category, where it really helped kind of place a stake.
It ignited it.
Place a stake in the ground for interest for those of us who enjoy what little rye whiskeys could be found at the time.
There were only 6 production ryes left, and several of them had stopped being bottled by 2007. It was insane.
And they weren't necessarily in the best condition.
No, they were not.
I remember Jimmy saying they made rye once a week for every year.
Yeah.
So
as good as the Wild Turkey rye was back then, I think it's better now.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But there was Old Overholt. Jim Beam made a rye.
Sure.
I think maybe Sazerac, possibly.
Sazerac came out with one in 2007. They did 1,000 cases. That was it.
And of course, Rittenhouse.
Yeah, and of course,
Rittenhouse. Yeah. Right. Heaven Hill. Right. Yep. Yeah. So, it was a handful. And then all the publicity about this thing and the rye whiskey, it just boomed. And at the same time, the bartenders were starting to go back to the classic cocktails and finding out that they were Manhattans and old fashions were all made with rye originally. Right. And so it was just the timing was right. Spirits were getting back on television. The public was interested in it. The cocktail culture was booming because of the bartenders and Sex in the City. Yeah. And, the timing absolutely this ignited the ride.
Yeah, Dale DeGroff and all those guys, Gary Regan and Dave Woodruff, they all really just pushed it in a really good direction.
Gary was at the launch and came on our first American Whiskey Trail trip. So and he was from up that way, right?
Yeah. He was a Hudson Valley guy.
Right. Yeah. Well, and of course Hudson Whiskey, right? It's from right there.
Yeah, Ralph Lorenzo. All right.
Yeah.
Anything else, David?
That is it, Frank. Thank you for joining Drinking on the Edge, Carlo. Thank you for leading Frank in this tour of the George Washington Distillery, its history, and its current operation.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.